The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Reedy with Grain Journal Magazine in Decatur, Illinois. Welcome to today's webinar, Design and Exclusion Principles for Pests of Stored Grain. This is the 11th in a series of webinars to be presented by Jeeps and Grain Journal Magazine in 2020. Today's webinar is sponsored by M&M Specialty Services. M&M specializes in protecting your people and your products with the best in quality and affordability in personal protection products, grain protectants, fumigants, and services. They are based in Leavenworth, Kansas. This webinar is also sponsored by VAA LLC, which has provided engineering and design services in the agribusiness industry since its founding in 1978. Working with owners, equipment vendors, and design-build contractors, the firm specializes in bulk commodity handling facilities, including slip-form design, material handling, transportation, and export. They are based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today's presenter is Dr. Matthew Fry of Cornell University. Matt is an extension educator with the New York State Integrated Pest Management Program at Cornell University. He provides education and conducts research related to pest management in and around buildings. Matt received his master's and PhD in entomology from the University of Delaware and worked as an urban entomologist in the pest management industry before joining the IPM program. As a note, today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website, www.grainnet.com, within 24 hours. All registrants will also receive an email with a link to the recording the day following the presentation. At this time, Matt, will you please do a voice check?
Good morning, John.
Good morning.
How do I sound?
You sound great. Thank you very much. Now, will you please show us your screen? Ladies and gentlemen, here is Dr. Matt Fry.
John, I'm not seeing the controls. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. And I'm going to turn on my video so I can see all of you out there in Cyberland today. So good morning. My name is Matt, and I am an entomologist. Thank you, John, for the introduction. Today's presentation is going to come at you from the perspective of me, somebody working in structural pest management. So you bring the expertise of storage of grain, and I will bring the expertise of pest exclusion. So hopefully there's some things that I'll learn through the question and answer session today from you about the challenges that you face and some of the opportunities that we may have to collaborate. So I want to start my presentation today with a little bit of a history lesson. Exclusion is a part of pest management that is often overlooked and forgotten, but it has a long history, especially in terms of structural pest management. So we have a quote here from one of the original textbooks on structural pest management from Hugo Hartnack in 1939. And he said, "We should have little trouble with vermin if our builders would hear and understand the language of vermin and would do a better job in eliminating entrances and hiding places for them." Very simple concept laid out in the 1930s, and yet we often see a reliance on chemical pesticides instead of keeping pests out of buildings. And of course, I love this image drawn in that book from 1939 showing the typical scenario that we see in building construction today, where you have a 2-inch pipe and a 4-inch opening for that pipe. If we just sealed that opening, we would prevent pests from coming inside. Of course, there's tremendous value in assessing the design and keeping pests out. The first and foremost is that it prevents issues of pests and disease from getting inside. If we have traps, if we have baits, and we have other control techniques inside, this isn't going to prevent contamination. It might just help slow the amount of product that is contaminated. Of course, with some of our pests, such as rodents, there's also the concern of structural damage. There's an estimate that 25% of fires of unknown origin in buildings is due to rodents chewing on wires in walls. So this type of damage, as well as gnawing on PEX piping and other type of fixtures that could cause water damage, could be prevented if we kept pests out of our buildings. So there's some challenges that are common, though, for the grain industry when it comes to pest problems. Some of these pests, the insect pests in particular, are very small. And so how do we use the appropriate materials to exclude these small organisms? Sometimes there's conflicts between ventilation and exclusion. We need to keep the products dry, but how can we keep pests out if we have a grate that's present for ventilation? So we'll look at some of these issues. Structures originally were not designed with exclusion in mind. So again, our builders weren't thinking about pest exclusion when they designed this. They might have left structural gaps that could easily allow pests to enter the facility. So now we have to go back and retrofit that exclusion practice. And unfortunately, because it is a specialty, exclusion can be expensive for large structures. So finding all the openings, using the appropriate material can be expensive. And finally, the hurdle that's often most difficult to overcome in the pest management industry is that it's a mindset that has to be changed. So we have to think about keeping pests out instead of just using products to manage pests. So the emphasis to date then when it comes to stored grain has been sanitation to remove food items that are present and hopefully remove infestations. Protective pesticide applications before binning. So, we have had an issue inside a particular bin, so we'll apply a protective pesticide application. Okay, not prevention. This is making an application. Protective pesticide applications after binning. Okay, maybe there's an issue with a pest problem, so we have to knock those pest numbers down. Cultural controls, maybe we can change the temperature and the humidity to make the environment less conducive to pests. And then, of course, monitoring to determine when there's a pest present so we can take a treatment action. But what we're going to talk about today is how to implement exclusion on top of what these current practices are. And we'll take it one step at a time. We'll walk through inspection, prioritization of what exclusion techniques to implement, what tools and materials we should utilize, how to actually perform the exclusion, and then evaluation to determine if our attempts have been successful. So inspection really is the key to all pest management problems. If we do a thorough inspection, we can define the scope and the extent of the pest problem. We can figure out where pests are located, what pests are present, and what actions we need to take in order to minimize their populations. It can help us to identify sanitation or water issues that are contributing to pest problems, and determine what materials and where to use in order to most effectively treat a pest problem. So one of the things to keep in mind for almost all pest problems that we face is that ideal harborage for pests, where they like to live and feed, are those places that are out of sight and quiet. They are going to preferentially locate themselves in areas that you will not find, because that's how they sustain their populations. So we need to remember to look in all those hard to see and hard to reach places if we're dealing with a pest problem. And this image, certainly not from a grain bin, but this is inside a building, and it's actually the drop ceiling. And above that, you can see all these mouse droppings. Rodents will use these protected areas to move throughout a facility and avoid detection by being above our radar. Another important part of inspection is to identify the pest accurately. When it comes to managing a pest population, our best bet is to know what our target pest is so that we can use the appropriate treatment. So I like to put this in the simple terms of effective pest management depends on accurate identification of the pest. And here we have two different rodent species. One is a rat and one is a mouse. And not just any type of mouse, but a house mouse. And there are tremendous differences between these two organisms in terms of where they prefer to build their nest site, what type of food they prefer to eat, what type of water they need. Do they need standing water like a rat on the left, or can they obtain their water from feeding on grains, such as the house mouse on the right? All of these factors are going to help us better manage the pest population, which is why it's critically important to identify the pest as accurately as possible. In addition to accurately identifying the pest, we also want to make considerations about their life stage. So for example, if we find these are Paramiscus or field mice, white-footed mice, or Paramiscus species of mice, the two different life stages can tell us something important about how we need to manage the population. On the left is a pup, a juvenile, and we know that juvenile animals, in particular rodents, but also cockroaches and other pests, do not travel far from their harborage site. So if we find a pup in a trap, we know that there's a nearby nest somewhere where that pup was found. On the other hand, if we find an adult, for example, we know that this particular species of mouse lives most of its life outdoors, but then enters structures to find food and shelter in the wintertime. So if they're being caught indoors, that means that we need to look for and seal exterior entry points. So even the life stage can tell us something different about our management plan. When we conduct our inspections, we are really focused on finding openings for these pests. And the two easiest ones to consider are openings for mice and openings for rats that we can seal. When it comes to those opening sizes, they are very strictly defined by the size of the mouse and rat skull. So there's a misconception in the pest management industry that rodent bodies are able to, collapse down. And the reality is that rodents can wiggle through an opening as long as they can fit their head through that gap. And you see here two different measurement sizes. So we have for mice an opening size of greater than 1/4 of an inch for gaps, and that's an opening that a mouse slips under. So think of a door when it's closed. If there's a gap of 1/4 of an inch or more, a mouse can fit under that gap. When it comes to round openings, the gap has to be a little bit wider because a mouse skull is wider than it is tall. So those openings would be 3/8 of an inch or greater. If there's an opening on your facility equal or greater to one of these sizes, then mice can easily find their way in. And we might look at these sizes and think that they're very small, but I have a short video to show you how a mouse gets itself through those openings. Typically, there would be music associated with this, and you can find this on our YouTube channel. But here you can see this is obviously a lab mouse that is well fed, wiggling itself through that opening. And it's kind of risky for this mouse to, once it sticks its head through, to make sure, push itself all the way through, because who knows if it's going to get stuck or get through to the other side. But as I said, if it can get its head through, it can get the rest of its body through. This mouse in particular had strong motivations to go through these openings, and you'll see why in just a second. You can also see that there's droppings and shavings in there from other rodents having gone through. And as they navigate through their environment, they're leaving behind pheromones and other cues that tell them another rodent has been this way, so it's worth checking out. And here's why. So there's food at the end of this trail. The reason that we're excluding rodent pests from structures is that there's food or shelter inside, which is a very powerful motivator for them. Of course, when it comes to rats, these are larger animals, so the size is going to be larger. For the gap, again, that they're going to slip under, it's going to be greater than 1/2 inch tall. And for openings, again, you could see here the reason that the openings are larger is that the bones around the eye socket are what make the skull wider. So this is going to be about 3/4 of an inch wide. Just a tool that I wanted to mention really briefly. This is something that I worked with the Excluder company to develop, and I can talk about it because I'm not making any profits on this. This is something that they receive profits from, and also the Pest Management Foundation, which funds research, gets a portion of the profits. But this tool is something that you can use to conduct these inspections. So one end of the tool is designed to be the dimensions of a mouse skull, and the other is designed to be the dimensions of a rat skull. If you can stick this probe through an opening, then a rodent of that size could get through. It also has portions of the tool that tell you if a pair of teeth marks are from a mouse or from a rat, and can help you distinguish droppings as mouse or rat droppings. So just an inspection tool that will help you to determine if mice or rats can get in. Unfortunately, the majority of the pests that we deal with are going to be insect pests, and the openings that permit them to enter spaces are extremely variable. This is a list of pests of public health importance. It isn't necessarily the pests of stored grain, but you can see wide ranges in the size that will permit them. And unfortunately, they're not as strict as they are with rodent skulls, because rodent skulls are a rigid bone structure, but insect body sizes can be compressed. They have a flexible outer exoskeleton that can be compressed in certain circumstances. So there's less accuracy with these numbers. We like to say that, insects can squeeze themselves through an opening depending on the size of their head capsule, which can be variable as well based on how much food they had as they're developing. So again, a lot less rigidity in those opening sizes. Keeping in mind that we're still talking about conducting inspections, we do have forms available on our website called the Scientific Coalition on Pest Exclusion. And the goal of this form is to help walk you through that inspection to identify the openings. It gives you step-by-step guidance in terms of always keeping a wall on the right-hand side of your body so that you don't miss any portion of the building, and gives you space to draw a diagram. And we'll just look at an example of what this would be for a distribution center, for example. So let's say we start on the top right corner of this building and we start walking and we hit this door. We find that there's an opening at the first door that we come to. So we take a picture, we circle it on the map, and then we use a subsequent form to identify what the pest problem is and how we would solve it. So this is obviously just an attempt to make it a very systematic approach to identifying openings, but this is something that you should be doing on a regular basis, especially for rodent pests that can easily lead to significant contamination risks. So these forms are available online for download if you're interested in something like this. Some of the common openings that we see, again, these pipe penetrations, if there's heating or other types of utilities in the building, making sure that the opening around that pipe is sealed completely will prevent pests from getting in. And then any structural gaps that have developed over time as buildings move or shift could provide openings for pests to enter. There's also concerns if you have loading docks or other types of structures associated with your facilities, gaps that are associated with the dock leveler or the dock door itself, and as well as the pull chain. So all of these, there are exclusion materials that are available to seal these gaps and prevent pests from entering. Another concern when we're conducting our inspection, especially on the exterior, is to look for any bridges that are created, whether it's by wires or vegetation. Here we have some examples of trees in direct contact with the roof line, or shrubs in direct contact with the building leading to windows. Any of these would provide an opportunity for rodent pests to climb and access, or create a conducive environment for insect pests to live amongst or alongside the building. So there are recommendations, if you're not doing this already, to remove and manage vegetation associated with the exterior portions of the building. There should be 6 to 8 feet of clearance from the building. This will reduce the moisture that's attractive to pests, as well as cover for burrowing rodents and perching sites. And also we can prune plants if it's a corporate office or something similar. We could prune plants on the exterior to make them vase shaped, which will make them less attractive to rodents and burrowing. Another option for vegetation management is to create a vegetation-free zone on the exterior of buildings. This again prevents burrowing because we're using stone here, about 1 inch diameter, about a 2-foot wide band, and 6 inch deep. This is also useful for conducting our inspections because now there's no vegetation on the exterior to get in our way as we're conducting our inspection. Roof inspections are particularly important in grain storage, so we want to look at air intake handlers to assess the filters and screens, make sure there's no tears, make sure there's no gaps or that it's fitting tightly. We want to look at exhaust to make sure that we're not dispersing food material onto the roof itself. Are there access doors that are propped open or that don't seal correctly? Is there pooling water or bird roosts? All of these issues would be identified during a roof inspection. Something that's not necessarily exclusion but relates to pest management is lighting. We know that night-flying insects are attracted to lights, and as a result, spiders are attracted to areas where light is being generated. So a spider will create its webs on this building because of the light, knowing that insects will come. It's useful to do nighttime inspections to identify where the lights are. Are they near openings? Are they near doors? And are there ways that we can position the light so that the beam of light is at the door, but the source of the light is away from the structure? This would help us to reduce the number of night-flying insects going towards the building. Some of these recommendations are presented here, and at the end of the slide set, I'll have a list of resources that provide some of this in more detail. When we're conducting our inspection on the interior, some of the things that we'll want to look at are sanitation. So we want to remove any food items from the previous year to prevent contamination of new products that are going into the bins. I think at this point, we've missed that window. But that's something certainly to put on your schedule for each year. And any sanitation efforts should be completed before exclusion is performed, because we want to make sure that there's no food items stuck in places that are then sealed over. Any decommissioned equipment should be removed from the facility. This provides harborage, especially for rodent pests. And there may be food residue associated with them. So anytime there's clutter, that's an opportunity to remove these items off-site to a location that would not be conducive to pests. Something that may be overlooked on the interior are drains. If there are floor drains to collect water from washing or any other types of cleaning, these can easily be clogged with debris, so we want to make sure that these are inspected on a regular basis to remove that dried debris. And then considerations for air pressure. So negative air pressure inside a building, which you feel if it's hard to open a door and you walk inside and you feel the breeze behind you, this will actually pull insects in. And you can see in this image, the light is on right above the doorway. So at night, this would be attractive to insects. Opening this door could pull those insects in. So some kind of assessment to determine how air flows within the facility, as well as air curtains that are used on the interior of the door or exterior to create a curtain of air blowing down, will prevent insects from being drawn into the facility. So again, all of that is inspection. That's the bulk of a pest management program, is to identify where the pest is, how it's getting in, and what we need to do to manage it. From here on out, we'll be talking about how to address those issues. One of the key considerations, and especially if you're a quality assurance professional, one of the key issues is to prioritize what needs to happen first. It's often overwhelming for a client to think about all the expensive repairs that they would have to do in a short amount of time to keep pests out. But if we can prioritize the key ones, the key areas that are allowing pests to enter, that is one way to make sure that things get done on a schedule and limits the number of pests that enter a facility. Again, this is a form that's available free from our website. It just helps to organize your thoughts in terms of, is this a high, medium, or low priority? Does this relate to exclusion? Is this a pest management issue, or is this something that has to do with sanitation? So this will help communicate, but also prioritize what issues should be addressed first. One of the questions that we often get with rodent problems in particular is the order of addressing that issue. So if you're dealing with rodents inside a facility and you just seal everything up, now you've actually created more problems for yourselves, because the rodents will behave in different ways, often in what are considered more aggressive ways, because now their main entryway is closed. So the thing that should be done when it comes to rodent populations is to trap and reduce that population first, seal any of the non-preferred entry points or movement pathways. And I've indicated that in this image with colors of severity. So in this scenario, the entrance on the outside to the inside is the most highly used, which you might learn by looking for evidence such as rodent droppings or the sebum marks that are left behind. Whatever method that we're using during our inspection, let's say we identify that as the key entry point. But the ones that are the pathways that are moving vertically or between rooms in this fictional facility, those may be used less often. So we can close those and make sure that we're not sealing the rodent population in. After we've trapped the rodent population, then we can seal that primary pathway. And of course, a consideration for personal safety in storage bins is that exclusion should only be performed when bins are empty. We would never want to be in a situation where there's grain within a facility and performing exclusion on that structure. Okay, so we're going to look quickly at tool and material selection, because this is a critical consideration when implementing an exclusion program. There's a number of things to keep in mind, and we'll walk through each of these briefly. So pest pressure is something that may not be easily quantified, but should be known to whoever is going to be performing the pest exclusion. And the environment is often dictates what the pest pressure is for that facility. These two images come from structural pest management, but I think you can relate to your own experience. The image on the left is a library front door, and the image on the right is a restaurant. Considering that one does not store food and one is a food preparation site, you can already assume that one of them is going to have higher pest pressure or the potential for pests to be active at that site. Secondly, the environment is much more conducive to pests in the image on the right. You could see salt splatter. You could see that this door is breaking down. So in this type of setting, we would want to use the best, most durable materials where there's the highest pest pressure and the environment is conducive to pests on the right. Whereas on the left, we may not need the top of the line materials to implement our exclusion program. And we'll look at some of those considerations as we move along. One of the common errors that we see with exclusion is that people use weatherization materials. So things like some types of expanding foam are used to make the indoor environment sealed against cold air drafts, but does not prevent rodents from getting inside. So rodents can overcome weatherization materials, whether it's just a rubber gasket door sweep or these insulating materials. They will chew through it, they'll push against it, they'll use each other, so other rodents will chew through, weakening the product, and then another rodent will come along and widen the gap. So these materials should not be used when there's high pest pressure. Another consideration is the permeability. So especially for grain bins, these structures need to breathe. If we sealed all the openings to be completely pest-proof, then we would create moisture problems. So when selecting the materials, we need to make sure that we're combining our knowledge of the permeability of the building with the pest-proofing material. So in particular, when it comes to ventilation and ventilator grills, they must not impede airflow. So the gauge that's recommended in most resource is that 1/2 inch mesh or 18-inch gauge or 18 gauge galvanized expanded metal is allowing the ventilator to breathe correctly. This will prevent rats from getting inside, but it will not prevent mice from getting inside. So we need to keep that in mind as we're selecting the materials. Another option for this particular type of ventilator would be to use louvered doors that would be closed when the vent is not operating. Okay, implementation. So there are resources that are available that discuss the different types of materials you might want to purchase and use for exclusion. These are 3 different articles that if you Google the keywords wildlife exclusion techniques at work, tools of the trade, etc., they will produce these lists of materials that are useful for implementing exclusion. I want to walk through what I consider to be the 3 levels of pest exclusion, because in the pest management world, what I often hear is that pest exclusion is too difficult for the average person to implement. But in many cases, we can start small and move to bigger openings as we gain expertise. So the basic level of exclusion would be to seal openings that are 1 inch or less. And this can be done with metal mesh fibers or elastomeric sealants. And it requires very basic supplies. So gloves, scissors, some kind of probe, a brush, a vacuum, and then a caulk gun to implement the elastomeric sealants. What I mean by metal mesh fibers are stainless steel metal mesh fibers that are abrasive for chewing rodents and do not rust. There's a variety of products that are available through distributors of pest management products. Copper mesh, for example, is not one that I would recommend in areas of high rodent activity because it's a softer material and is not as abrasive. But these stainless steel metal mesh fibers are abrasive, and because they're stainless steel, do not rust and do not break down. And these can easily seal an opening of 1 inch or less against rodent and insect pests. And it's as easy as sticking the material in there and using a probe such as a screwdriver to secure it in place. Very simple for 1 inch openings. Again, sealants, these are important it's important to distinguish between a sealant and a caulk. Caulks are materials that have low elastomeric values, which means that over time they dry and they actually pull away from surfaces as they harden. This will not create a tight seal, especially against insect pests, whereas sealants with high elastomeric values remain flexible and create long-term contact with all surfaces. So this will, over time, prevent insects from getting through that opening. If you're looking for recommendations on what type of products to use for these 1 inch openings, there's an article in Pest Control Technology magazine And if you Google this title, Pest Proofing Small Holes, you'll get that article. It provides instructions on how to seal small openings and then also offers product recommendations, especially those sealants with high elastomeric values. So the next level from beginner, we're going to talk about openings that are 1 to 4 inches in size and doors. And this requires just a little bit of training. And the reason that I include some of these materials here is that it requires supplies that are a little more expensive. So using a drill for installing door sweeps, maybe a piece of equipment that is a little more expensive that you wouldn't want to give out to somebody that just does general repairs. So this would be the use of hardware cloth, door sweeps, and vertical seals, and using these tools. If you remember earlier in our inspection phase, we talked about the different size openings that permit pests. And interestingly, when we look at hardware cloth, there are 2 main sizes. There's 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch. Based on the size of rodent skulls, we know that the 1/2 inch would prevent mice from entering, and we know that 1/2 inch would exclude rats from entering, and 1/4 inch would prevent mice from entering. Given the option, we would want to use the woven galvanized hardware cloth, as this is stronger than the welded type. And it's important to consider fasteners and the substrate that we're putting this exclusion material on. If we simply used staples or nails, a rodent might be able to push or pull against those materials and pull off the hardware cloth. So we want to use screws with washers to create a tight seal. We want to make sure that there's no edges or corners that can be gnawed, and try to avoid things that are the quick and easy fix like staple guns. When it comes to door sweeps, there are 2 main types that should be implemented. The first are high density brush sweeps, which will prevent crawling insects and can prevent mice. And the second are the rubber encased steel fabric sweeps, which prevent insects and rodents. And I do want to offer the caveat here that in areas where there's high rodent pressure, brush sweeps, there are limitations. You can see in the top image that the door sweep has been completely chewed by rodents. We see a number of droppings here, and those dark stains are what are called sebum marks that are left behind as rodents enter or walk over the same spot over and over. On the bottom image, you saw this before, but this is another type of brush sweep that was, again, chewed by rodents, staying in contact with the wall and entering right at that corner of the door. So if there's high rodent pressure, we want to select the materials that are going to last a little bit longer. Installation isn't just as simple as, okay, I bought this material, I'm just gonna zip, put it up. We need to make sure that it's properly flushed against the door, that it creates a tight seal on the bottom, and that the product actually eliminates the gaps that they're intended to. In the image on the right, this door would benefit from having a vertical seal that goes in the gap between the 2 double doors to prevent rodents or insects from entering that space as well. If you have roll-up doors in your facilities, there are different types of materials. We talked about the rubber gaskets not being sufficient for rodent problems, but there are rubber gaskets filled with the stainless steel metal mesh fibers that will prevent rodents from entering. And then the last level, I consider it to be advanced exclusion because it does require expertise with the use of masonry supplies, carpentry, and sheet metal, including a bender to bend metal into the appropriate dimensions. So this is something that you may have someone on staff, or you may be the person on staff that has this expertise, but this is a little bit beyond the scope of most people's general knowledge. You wouldn't want to just use these materials in a way that isn't using expertise, because you may think that you've sealed the opening, but if it's not done correctly, you may still be vulnerable to pest entry. There are specifications for all of these types of materials in a document called Pest Prevention by Design, which I'll reference at the end. Of course, there are some special considerations when it comes to grain bins and storage of grain. So first would be exclusion of birds. There are a huge variety of materials that are available to prevent roosting and nesting of birds, whether they are netting materials that are installed to prevent roosting or nesting, or spikes, shock tracks, all types of materials. I would speak to the various vendors about what product is best for your situation, but there's no shortage of materials for bird exclusion. And then, of course, grain bin vents. So we want to make sure that insects in particular cannot access the storage through these vents. We want to make sure that the vents are covered with some sort of sieve, screen, or cloth that will prevent insect entry, but also allows airflow. So this recommendation is an opening of 0.2 millimeters or more to allow proper airflow. Maybe check on our standard operating procedures to make sure that these are checked regularly, to make sure that there's no debris that has been accumulated. Maybe we need to vacuum them regularly. I'm sure all of this information is something that you're aware of, but keeping these structures in mind to prevent them from being a source of infestation or allowing insects to enter the facility is critical. Okay, just some other considerations. So maybe downward facing screens or removable screens that we can easily take off and vacuum. And then for inactive vents, as we said earlier, perhaps louvered vents, caps for covers. All of these will reduce entry of pests and allow for moisture to evaporate from the structure. And finally, with any pest management program, if we implement any type of control measure or prevention measure, the last step is to evaluate how effective it was. If we don't evaluate, if we don't reassess our work and how it's working, we really have no understanding of how we're going to better manage pests in that setting. So keeping a log of what you did and where, determining if it was effective, this can be assessed through monitoring. What do you need to do in the future? Are there additional things that you need to repair and replace? Just because you've implemented the top of the line door sweep, for example, doesn't mean that it won't wear down over time. So we need to constantly assess the materials that we've used for exclusion. This can be done in annual inspections, at least twice a year, because there are considerations over winter. Maybe there was damage to the structure from freezing and thawing, or things moved. So in the spring to assess that damage, and then in the fall, before harvest, hopefully to verify that there are no new entry points. And the last thing I'll mention is about human behavior. So this is definitely an exclusion concern. People leave doors open, people prop doors open of facilities, people are coming in and out. So especially when there's a high pest population nearby, we want to make sure that we're addressing human behaviors that would allow pests to enter a facility, keeping doors closed, and then replacing screens that are part of the human part of structures. So there are a number of resources. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. These are specific to grain storage in particular, from Purdue and Kansas State University, as well as Utah. And then perhaps you'd like to take a screenshot of this, or we can share these resources later, but resources on lighting, on different materials that are available, different items that need to be sealed, and the rest of the resources here. So with that, I think we are going to take some questions if there are any.
Thank you for a great presentation today, Matt. This does conclude the presentation portion of today's event. We will now begin our Q&A session. If you have not yet submitted your questions, you may do so now. Looks like our first question today. You mentioned that one of the benefits of exclusion is that it can reduce risks of contamination and rodent-borne disease. Can you explain what kinds of risks come from rodent contamination?
Yes. So, one of the things that we think about when we're concerned about rodents is and other pests is them consuming the materials. But actually, the greater risk is from rodent contamination of our products. And when it comes to rodents in particular, they present a huge contamination risk. They are known to carry a number of pathogens that they can transmit to people, whether it's through their feces, their urine, ectoparasites that may be found on their body. So they may contaminate food items in that way, and also be a health risk for people as well.
Okay, our next question. Can I get rid of my exterior baiting program if I seal all openings on my buildings?
So that, another good question to think about is if you're paying a contractor or if you're putting out bait on the exterior of your facilities, if you take the proactive measures to prevent pest problems indoors, do you need to still have a baiting program on the outside? And I would say yes, but there are ways to modify that if you do effective exclusion. One of the things that can be done is to switch from an active ingredient that is a rodenticide to a monitoring block. And there are some really good justifications to do this. One of those is that the monitoring blocks will actually train rodent pests to come to the bait station. So if they're in the environment, they'll feed on this non-toxic monitoring block and get used to coming and visiting that bait station. At that time, you can put out a rodenticide with an active ingredient or install traps in that bait station to capture the rodents. The non-toxic monitoring blocks have other advantages as well. They have within them a marking dye that will fluoresce when it's hit with ultraviolet light. So you can use a UV light to inspect around that bait station and follow the tracks of where rodents are moving and maybe how they're getting into the facility. If there are fluorescent droppings or fluorescent urine on the inside of the facility, but you only have bait on the exterior, you know that rodents are somehow gaining access. So you can use a UV light inspection to find that opening. So again, there's advantages to keeping a monitoring program in place with bait stations on the exterior of a facility, and you can easily switch that over to a rodenticide if necessary.
Okay, our next question. Is there a chart that lists the common rodent species and their particular habits or biology relating to IPM?
That's a good question. So I know of a single chart that's like that, that's very helpful, and it comes from one of the pesticide manufacturers. If you wanted to email me, I can send that information to you. I'll bring up my first slide again here that has my contact information. So yeah, that Leafitech is a company that produces rodenticides, and they have a chart that talks about the different sizes of rodents and some of their behaviors. But most of that comes from technical fact sheets, which there's a number of really great fact sheets, a couple pages long, not too much to read. So I'd be happy to send those along as well.
Okay, next question. Some of my buildings are really old with lots of gaps and openings. Is it really possible to seal all the openings to keep these pests out?
So that's a tough one. As we mentioned, most buildings were not constructed with pest prevention in mind. And one of the resources that I referenced today is a document called Pest Prevention by Design. And the goal of that document is to give builders the tools to create a new building that doesn't have gaps and would prevent pests from getting inside. Unfortunately, most buildings, what we have to do is pest prevention despite design, because the design allows pests to enter. So in those cases, I think the challenge is the prioritization step, figuring out where pest problems are most prevalent, how pests are getting inside, and addressing those first. This is, both a pest management strategy to make sure that we are keeping the pests out, and also a financial decision, because we have to consider how much money can we spend on keeping pests out of the facility. So, I think it's possible with time and dedication to remove all those openings that would allow pests to enter, but it does incur a serious cost.
Okay, thank you. That is all the time we have for questions today, and we want to thank you all for your participation. If your question was not answered, it will be forwarded to our presenter. I would like to thank our sponsors, M&M Specialty Services and VAA LLC, for their support in bringing you today's webinar. I also want to thank Jeeps and our presenter, Dr. Matt Fryer, for joining us today. Jeeps provides the best networking education and professional development for all levels of experience in the industry. So, where can Jeeps help you? To start, they can enhance education through online training, local meetings, and events. They can help you expand your network of colleagues, industry leaders, and create new friendships. And they can help you meet people that can help you. Jeeps connects you with 26 chapters across North America. Industry leaders and experts are only a call or a click away. Learn more about what Jeeps can do for you by visiting jeeps.com/membership. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing on graynet.com within 24 hours. All registrants will also receive an email containing a link to the recording. Thank you all for attending, and please have a great and safe day.